As you drift off to sleep tonight, we'll tell the story of one of the most fascinating people. If our stories help you relax and fall asleep, please subscribe. It would mean the world to us. And now, as you continue to relax, let's begin. Tonight's story is about Shakira. A large house rests in a silence that feels heavier than night itself, as if the walls are still holding on to echoes that no longer belong there. Somewhere in the distance, a light is still on, though no one seems to be moving toward it. The air feels paused, like the world forgot to finish its last breath. In rooms where music once filled every corner, only the soft hum of stillness remains. It is the kind of silence that does not ask for attention, but quietly takes it anyway. And somewhere within this quiet, a life continues gently, long after the public world has turned away. There are places in the house where footsteps once moved quickly, almost rhythmically, as if even walking had a tempo of its own. Now those same spaces feel slower, softer, as though time itself has learned to lower its voice. A piano sits untouched, not abandoned, just resting, like it is waiting for a moment that does not need to arrive. The windows reflect distant city lights, but inside, nothing competes with the stillness. Even the smallest sounds feel intentional here, like they are afraid of disturbing something unseen. It is in this softened atmosphere that thoughts begin to drift without direction. In one quiet corner of memory, there is a younger version of Shakira in Barranquilla, where the air feels warmer and more open, and the world has not yet learned her name. Not in the form of fame, but in the form of curiosity. She moves through days that are filled with small observations, a rhythm found in everyday life, not yet shaped into stages or lights. There is a sense of listening in everything she does, as if sound itself is something she's always trying to understand more deeply. Even silence back then had a different texture, less heavy, more like possibility waiting quietly in the background. There are afternoons remembered not through events, but through sensations, the feeling of paper beneath a pen that refuses to stop moving, the way a melody might arrive without warning, as if it was already waiting in the room, windows open to street sounds that mix with thoughts too quickly to separate, and somewhere in that mix there is always a sense of being slightly outside of everything, observing rather than fully entering. It is not loneliness exactly, but something softer and harder to define. Years later, that same sense of observation still exists, though now it is surrounded by a world that never stops watching back. Hotel rooms in distant cities become temporary quiet spaces, where luggage stays half open and time zones blur together. The light outside changes, but inside routines remain strangely delicate. A notebook might sit near a bed, pages half filled, as if ideas arrive in fragments rather than complete thoughts. The silence here is different too, not empty, but layered with distance. It carries the weight of movement, of always being between places. Sometimes, after performances, there is a moment when everything feels slightly delayed, as if reality is catching up from far behind. The stage lights fade, but their after-image lingers in perception. Voices from the crowd dissolve into memory slowly, not all at once. Backstage corridors feel longer than they should, stretching time into something less predictable. And in those corridors, the world feels both incredibly close and strangely unreachable at the same time. It's in this in-between space that reflection quietly begins. Rooms filled with costumes and instruments do not feel chaotic, even when filled with movement earlier in the day. Instead, they settle into order again, as if nothing had disturbed them at all. A chair remains slightly turned, a glass of water untouched, a mirror reflecting an empty space that once held presence. These details do not speak loudly, but they stay. They become part of a rhythm that continues even after the performance ends, and within that rhythm there is a calm that does not fully belong to rest or to activity. There are nights when sleep arrives slowly, not because of restlessness, but because the mind continues to wander through sound. Not loud sound, but remembered sound. The echo of rehearsals, fragments of lyrics, the invisible architecture of melody. Thoughts do not rush. They drift, like water moving through familiar paths. The body rests, but awareness remains lightly awake, noticing everything without needing to respond. It is a quiet state that feels neither awake nor asleep, but somewhere gently in between. Travel becomes its own kind of silence over time. Airports blur into each other, hotel hallways repeat like soft patterns, and cities pass outside windows without demanding attention. Inside this repetition, something subtle forms, a comfort in not needing to anchor fully in any one place. Even conversations begin to feel like echoes, not because they lack meaning, but because they are surrounded by so much movement. And in that movement, stillness becomes something internal rather than external. In private moments, away from cameras and sound checks, there is often simplicity that contrasts with everything else. A meal eaten slowly, a conversation that does not need to lead anywhere, a moment of looking out a window without purpose. These moments do not announce themselves as important, yet they hold a different kind of weight. They are not defined by audience or expectation. They exist quietly, as if reminding the mind that not everything needs to be performed. The idea of music itself changes shape in these private hours. It is no longer something that fills arenas, but something that appears in fragments of thought. A rhythm tapped softly on a surface, a melody hummed without intention, a memory of sound rather than sound itself. Creativity does not always arrive fully formed. Sometimes it drifts in like a half-remembered dream, and in that drifting, there is a calm acceptance that nothing needs to be complete immediately. There are reflections that come only when everything else is settled, not dramatic realizations, but small understandings that appear quietly and leave just as softly. The awareness that identity is not fixed to any one version of self. The sense that movement between worlds, stage and silence, public and private, is not a contradiction, but rhythm. These thoughts do not demand resolution. They simply exist alongside everything else, like background light that never fully turns off. Even in stillness, there is a feeling of continuation, as if nothing truly stops but only changes form. A life built on sound does not become silent, it becomes differently audible. The absence of performance does not mean absence of presence. Instead, presence shifts inward, becoming less visible but more constant. And in this inward space, time feels less like progression and more like layering. At night, when the house is fully quiet again, there is a softness in how everything seems to settle, not into sleep immediately, but into a gentler awareness of being. The world outside continues its movement, but it feels far away, almost irrelevant to this moment. Inside, there is only breath, memory, and the faint impression of all the places the mind has been. Nothing demands attention, and nothing needs to be resolved. It is enough simply to remain here, within this quiet continuation. A faint glow from a distant room spills softly across a polished floor, stretching into long shapes that shift slightly as the night deepens. Nothing in the house feels fully awake, yet nothing feels completely asleep either. It is as if the entire space is suspended in a quiet in-between, where time forgets to move forward. In this stillness, the memory of sound seems to linger longer than sound itself ever did. Even the air feels careful, as though it has learned not to interrupt what is already fading gently into rest. Somewhere beyond the walls the city continues, but it does not enter here fully. In moments like these, the mind drifts back to earlier chapters of life, not in sequence, but in fragments that appear without warning. A small room in Barranquilla returns in pieces, light through curtains, the sound of distant street life, a young girl listening more than speaking. That younger version of Shakira is not framed by fame or expectation yet, only by curiosity that moves quietly through everything she observes. Music at that time is not a career or identity, but something more instinctive, like breathing in rhythm. Even silence in those early spaces feels less like absence and more like a blank page waiting for sound to find it. There is a particular kind of memory that does not feel like remembering, but like re-entering. The feeling of sitting on a bed with ideas arriving too quickly to hold properly. A notebook open, not filled with plans, but with pieces of thoughts that do not yet belong to anything specific. Outside, life continues in ordinary ways, yet inside something less ordinary is forming without announcement. There is no clear beginning to it, only a slow accumulation of attention towards sound, movement and feeling. It is almost as if the world is being learned through listening rather than looking. Years later, that same listening becomes part of everything, even when surrounded by noise that belongs to millions of others. On stage, lights flood the space, but between moments of performance, there is a different awareness, one that watches rather than participates. The crowd becomes a wave of sound that rises and falls, but beneath it there is always a quieter layer only she can feel. It is not emptiness, but a separate channel of perception that continues running alongside the visible world. And when the performance ends, that hidden channel does not close immediately. It lingers. Backstage corridors after a show feel almost unreal, as if they belong to a different version of time. The brightness of the stage fades too quickly, leaving behind a softer, more uncertain lighting. Voices echo briefly, then disappear into distance. Crew members move with practiced calm, collecting equipment, resetting spaces that were just moments ago alive with sound. In these transitions, identity feels less fixed, more like something that shifts depending on where attention rests. The energy of performance slowly dissolves, but its echo remains within the body. Hotel rooms become familiar not because they are the same, but because of how consistently they are temporary. A suitcase half open near a chair. Clothes placed without urgency. A window showing a city that will soon become memory. These spaces do not demand presence, yet presence fills them anyway. It is here that silence feels different again. Not empty, but structured by distance. Even thoughts seem to slow down, as if they understand they are only passing through. In those quiet hours, creativity does not arrive as a single idea, but as fragments that float into awareness without permission. A rhythm might appear first, then dissolve before it can be fully held. A lyric might form partially, then shift into something else entirely. Nothing is stable, yet everything feels connected. It is not productivity, but continuity. An ongoing internal conversation that never fully stops. And in that continuity, there is a comfort that does not require explanation. There are nights when sleep does not feel like an escape, but like a gradual softening of attention. The mind does not shut down. It loosens. Thoughts become less structured, moving like water without direction. The body rests, but awareness remains lightly present, noticing the texture of silence in the room. Outside, the world continues its motion, but it no longer feels urgent or close. Everything important has already shifted inward. Between tours and recordings, time begins to lose its sharp edges. Days are no longer clearly separated, but layered into each other like overlapping impressions. Airports, cars, rehearsal spaces, hotel rooms, all blend into a rhythm that is more internal than external. In this rhythm, stillness is not found in place, but in perception. Even movement begins to feel like repetition rather than change. And within repetition, something quietly stabilizes. There are moments when reflection arrives unexpectedly, not as deep thought, but as a subtle awareness of distance. Distance from earlier versions of life. Distance from the idea of being fully known by any single moment. These reflections do not feel heavy. They feel neutral, almost observational, as if life is being watched from slightly above, not detached, but gently aware. And in that awareness there is no need for conclusion. Private hours often carry the most ordinary gestures: pouring water, adjusting a lamp, sitting without intention. Yet within these gestures there is a kind of grounding that does not depend on recognition. The absence of audience does not create emptiness, it creates space for unnoticed existence. Here, nothing is performed and nothing is measured. Even silence feels less like absence and more like permission. Music in these moments becomes something internal again, not something played or recorded, but something remembered in sensation, a rhythm felt in the timing of breath, a melody appearing briefly in thought, then dissolving. The body remembers patterns even when they are not expressed, and in that memory there is continuity between all versions of self: the young listener, the performer, the traveller, the mother, the observer. At times, the awareness of being seen by many contrasts quietly with the experience of being entirely alone in a room. Both are real, yet neither fully defines the other. The world outside builds an image, but inside there is only continuity of thought, feeling, and perception. That contrast does not create conflict, it creates texture. A life experienced in layers rather than in a single surface, and in the deepest quiet of night, when everything external has settled into distance, there is only the subtle presence of being, not defined by sound, not shaped by movement, not held by expectation, just awareness continuing gently without urgency. The house remains still but not empty. The silence remains but not hollow. It is simply there, like something that has always existed and will continue without needing to be understood. The night deepens further, and the house begins to feel less like a structure and more like a breathing pause in time. Shadows stretch across corners that once held movement and conversation, now softened into stillness. A distant clock marks time, but even its rhythm feels restrained, as if it too understands the importance of quiet. Outside, faint traces of a life continue, cars passing far away, a wind brushing against glass, but none of it fully enters this space. Everything remains gently separated, like layers that no longer need to touch. And in that separation, there is a strange kind of calm that settles deeper than sleep. In one of the rooms, a soft lamp remains on, casting a warm circle of light over objects that no longer need attention. A notebook lies open, not as a statement of work, but as a pause that was never closed. Pages contain fragments, half-formed lyrics, small observations, words that might later become something else entirely. There is no urgency attached to them now. They simply exist, like thoughts waiting without expectation. This quiet continuation of creation feels less like effort and more like instinct. There is a memory that returns often in moments like this. Not a single event, but a feeling of early awareness. A young version of Shakira sitting in a space where sound is not yet performance, but exploration. Listening closely to how words change when spoken softly, how rhythm can exist even in silence. At that time, music is not something external to reach for. It is something internal being discovered slowly. The world around her is ordinary, but within that ordinariness, attention is already doing something unusual. It is noticing everything. Years later, that same attention remains, though it now moves through environments that are far more complex. The scale of life has expanded, stages, audiences, cities that recognize her before she speaks. Yet internally, the process of listening has not changed its nature. Even in the loudest moments, there is always a part that observes quietly from within. It is not separate from experience, but parallel to it, like another layer of awareness that never fully participates in the noise. After performances, when the energy of the stage dissolves, there is often a subtle shift that is difficult to describe. Not exhaustion alone, but a kind of emotional quieting, as if something has been expressed fully and now needs no continuation. The transition from presence in front of thousands to presence in solitude is not abrupt. It is gradual, almost careful. Costumes are removed, lights dim, and conversations become softer. Even movement slows without instruction. It is in these transitions that the mind begins to return to itself. In hotel rooms after travel, the sense of unfamiliar familiarity becomes stronger. Everything is arranged temporarily, yet repeatedly. A bed that is not owned, a window that frames a city that will soon be left behind. These spaces hold no history, yet they collect emotional residue. The silence here feels structured by absence rather than emptiness. It is not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of everything having already happened somewhere else. There are moments when the body rests, but the mind continues its soft movement through memory, not replaying events, but drifting through impressions. The feeling of standing backstage before walking into light, the sound of rehearsals fading into distance, the brief pause before a song begins in front of an audience. These fragments do not form a narrative, they form a rhythm, and that rhythm continues even when nothing external is happening. Outside the room, the world of fame continues its own existence. Articles, images, interpretations, constant recognition. But inside, none of it feels present in this moment. There is only the immediate reality of quiet objects, soft lighting, and unspoken thought. The contrast between public perception and private experience exists, but it does not create tension. Instead, it becomes part of how life is understood, through layers that do not always meet. Motherhood adds another dimension to this quiet landscape, not as a shift away from identity, but as an expansion of it. Moments become more grounded, more immediate. Time is no longer only divided by travel or performance, but also by presence in smaller daily rhythms. A conversation held without interruption. A shared silence that does not require explanation. In these spaces, attention becomes softer, more anchored in the present rather than in movement between places. There is a kind of reflection that arrives not through thought, but through still observation. Watching light change across a wall, listening to the subtle hum of a room that contains no urgency, feeling the absence of performance not as loss, but as return. These reflections do not conclude anything. They simply exist for a moment before dissolving again into quiet awareness. Music creation itself becomes more internal in these times. Not always structured, not always recorded. Sometimes it is only rhythm felt in thought, or fragments of melody that appear and disappear without being captured. The creative process becomes less about output, and more about continuity, a thread that runs beneath everything else, even when not actively followed. And in that thread, identity feels less defined by role and more by perception. At night, when everything settles further, the house feels less like a location and more like a continuation of inner space. Each room holds its own quiet, but together they form a single atmosphere of stillness. There is no urgency in any direction. Even time seems to soften, losing its edges. In this softened state, awareness becomes less focused and more diffused, as if gently spread across everything equally. And somewhere in that diffusion there is a subtle understanding that nothing here needs to be held tightly. Not memory, not identity, not even thought. Everything is allowed to move at its own pace or not move at all. The silence does not ask for interpretation. It simply continues, steady and unbroken, like something that does not begin or end but remains. The early hours before dawn feel different from the rest of the night, as if the silence itself has grown deeper rather than simply continued. The house no longer feels divided into rooms and corridors in the same way. Instead, it feels unified by stillness. Even the faintest sounds, air moving through ventilation, a distant shift of something settling, seem amplified by the absence of everything else. It is not emptiness, but a kind of suspended awareness where nothing new is introduced and nothing is required to change. Time does not feel absent here. It feels softened beyond recognition. In this softened space, memory begins to behave differently. It no longer arrives in clear images, but in fragments of sensation, light, rhythm, texture. A stage light warming the skin before a performance begins, the quiet inhale before stepping into sound, the distant memory of applause that no longer feels immediate, but instead feels like it belongs to another layer of existence. These fragments do not connect in a strict timeline. They float gently without needing to form a sequence. There is a version of life remembered from earlier years in Barranquilla, where attention was shaped by observation rather than recognition. A young Shakira listening to rhythms that existed before they had names, noticing how everyday life carried its own unnoticed music. The sound of movement in streets, the cadence of spoken words, the natural timing of gestures, all of it forming a kind of invisible training ground for awareness. At that time, nothing felt separate from rhythm. Even silence had its own quiet structure. That early sensitivity to sound did not disappear with time. Instead, it expanded and adapted to new environments. Now it exists within spaces filled with production, travel, performance, and global attention. Yet underneath all of it, the same instinct remains, to notice how things feel before they are understood. This instinct does not rely on analysis, it relies on presence. And presence in this life has always been layered. When the world becomes louder, the inner perception does not necessarily become quieter. It becomes more selective. On stage, everything is amplified: movement, sound, light, response. But beneath that amplification, there is still an internal channel that processes everything differently. It does not react. It observes. It does not participate in applause or noise. It registers patterns, timing, shifts. This parallel awareness becomes almost like a companion that never leaves, even in the most crowded spaces. After performances, when adrenaline fades slowly rather than instantly, there is a subtle recalibration. The body returns to itself in stages. First, the external sound diminishes, then emotional intensity, then the awareness of being perceived. What remains is a quiet neutrality, not exhaustion, but transition. Walking through backstage corridors, everything feels slightly delayed, as if reality is catching up from a short distance behind. Lights feel softer, conversations less structured, movement more instinctive. In those moments, solitude does not arrive as isolation. It arrives as relief from direction. There is no need to perform even privately, no need to align with expectation or interpretation. The mind begins to settle into its own pace again, no longer synchronized with external rhythm. And in that return, thoughts become less structured, more fluid, less about meaning, and more about presence. Hotel rooms across different cities become familiar not through sameness, but through repetition of experience. Each one temporarily holds a version of the same quiet ritual. Entering, placing belongings down, adjusting light, sitting for a moment without purpose. Outside, unfamiliar cities continue their motion, but inside everything slows down into a shared pattern. The window becomes a frame for a world that is observed but not entered. And in that observation, distance becomes comfortable. There are nights when sleep feels less like an endpoint and more like a gradual fading of awareness. Thoughts do not stop, they soften. Images drift in and out without urgency. A lyric might appear briefly, then dissolve before being held. A memory might surface without warning, then disappear again into stillness. The boundary between thinking and resting becomes unclear, and that lack of boundary creates a gentle suspension. Even in motherhood, time reshapes itself quietly. It becomes less about movement between stages and more about presence within small, ordinary intervals. A shared silence carries more weight than conversation. A moment of still observation becomes more meaningful than structured activity. Identity does not divide. It expands into multiple forms of attention existing at once. Performer, observer, parent, traveller. None of these roles fully replace the others. They coexist without needing resolution. There is a softness in this coexistence that becomes more noticeable in still hours. the awareness that life does not need to be understood as a single narrative. Instead, it can exist as overlapping rhythms, each one valid in its own space. Some rhythms are public, some are private, some are remembered, some are ongoing. None of them cancel the others, they simply layer. In the deepest part of the night, when everything external has fully retreated, there is only the quiet presence of being, not defined by sound, not shaped by movement, not held by recognition. Just awareness continuing gently without demand. The house does not feel empty in this state. It feels complete in its stillness, and that stillness does not ask to be filled. Somewhere within it, there is no longer a distinction between beginning and continuation, only a steady, quiet presence that remains even when everything else fades into softness. The first trace of morning does not arrive as light at once, but as a gradual suggestion through the edges of the room. Darkness does not leave, it simply becomes less defined, losing its density in small, almost unnoticeable steps. The house responds without movement, as if it has learned to shift between night and day without announcing the change. Silence is still present, but it feels lighter now, less layered, more transparent. Even the air feels like it has changed its intention, no longer holding stillness so tightly. In this early transition, there is a feeling that nothing truly resets, yet everything quietly repositions itself. Objects in the room remain exactly where they were, but their presence feels slightly different under the first softness of light. A glass near the bed reflects a faint glow. Fabric folds carry subtle gradients of shadow and warmth. These small details become more visible not because they change, but because attention returns to them with less effort. In memory, mornings from earlier years appear in fragments, not as full scenes. A young Shakira waking in a space where sound has not yet begun, where ideas from the previous night still linger in unfinished forms. Back then, mornings are not defined by schedule, but by sensation, the awareness of thoughts that survived sleep, the quiet pull toward expression before the day fully begins. There is a continuity between night and morning that does not feel broken, only gently stretched. As life expands into larger stages, mornings become more layered. Travel shifts perception of time so that waking is no longer tied to a single place. Hotel curtains replace familiar windows. Different cities introduce different shades of light. Yet despite this variation, the internal experience remains surprisingly consistent. There is always a brief moment of stillness before engagement begins again, a pause where nothing is required and nothing has yet been asked. In that pause, awareness often moves without direction, not thinking in structured ways, but drifting through impressions. The feeling of yesterday's performance still slightly present in the body, the echo of music not fully gone, as if it has settled somewhere beneath awareness. There is no urgency to interpret it. It simply remains as a soft after-image of expression. And slowly, even that begins to fade into the background of the new day. The house, or any temporary space, feels different in morning light compared to night silence. Night feels inward, morning feels outward. Yet neither demands action immediately. There is a shared softness between them, a transitional calm that does not belong to either state fully. In this calm, time feels less structured, as if it is waiting to be reintroduced rather than already in motion. There are moments when reflection happens without intention, not deep thought, but simple noticing. How quiet everything is before the world begins its demands. How even identity feels less defined before interaction starts again. In these moments, the mind does not analyze life. It simply observes its current shape, and that shape feels less fixed than it appears from the outside. Throughout years of performance, creation, travel, and recognition, there remains a consistent undercurrent that does not shift with circumstance. It is the act of listening, not only to music, but to everything that surrounds it: tone, silence, rhythm, breath. This way of perceiving does not disappear in fame, it adapts. It becomes quieter internally while remaining active beneath everything else. There is something subtle about returning to awareness each morning. It does not feel like starting over, but like continuing from a place that was never fully interrupted. Thoughts from the previous day do not end. They simply lose intensity. Emotions do not reset. They soften into neutrality. And within this softened continuation, the sense of self feels less like a fixed point and more like a flow that resumes gently. In private spaces, before any external role is re-entered, there is often a quiet simplicity to being. Sitting without purpose, looking without intention, listening without needing to respond. These moments do not need meaning to exist fully. They are complete in their lack of demand. And in that lack of demand, something stabilizes internally. Even creativity, which often feels associated with performance and output, behaves differently in this state. It does not arrive as urgency. It arrives as possibility. A line of melody that may or may not develop. A phrase that may or may not become something later. Nothing is forced to become complete immediately. It is allowed to exist in unfinished form, which is often where it feels most natural. The world outside begins to gradually reassert itself. Movement increases, sound returns, schedules resume their shape. But the internal quiet does not disappear entirely. It remains underneath activity, like a background layer that never fully turns off. Even in motion, there is a part that continues observing without effort. And so the day begins not with a sharp transition, but with a slow blending of states. Night dissolving into morning, silence merging into sound, stillness merging into movement. Nothing is lost in this shift. It simply changes form. What remains is the same quiet continuity that has always been present. Not separate from life, but woven through it, gently steady, even as everything else begins again. The day does not fully arrive all at once. It unfolds in layers, as if the world is remembering how to be active again after a long pause. Light strengthens slowly across surfaces, revealing textures that were invisible only moments ago. The house, now no longer held by night, begins to feel more ordinary, but not less quiet. Even as distant sounds from outside grow more defined, they do not disturb the internal stillness that remains. It is as though silence has simply moved deeper rather than disappeared. In this softened daylight, small routines begin without urgency, not as obligations, but as gentle re-entry into movement. A hand brushing against a surface, a slow walk through a hallway, the subtle awareness of space becoming more structured again. Nothing feels abrupt. Everything transitions in a way that allows presence to remain uninterrupted. Even thought begins to take on a slightly more organized shape, though still quiet, still unforced. There are moments when memory rises unexpectedly, not as a complete scene, but as a feeling attached to sound. A rhythm once heard during early creative years in Barranquilla returns faintly, carried not by detail, but by sensation. A younger Shakira moving through a world where music is not yet separated from daily life, where everything observed has the potential to become sound later. That early relationship with rhythm was not structured. It was instinctive, almost inseparable from attention itself. Over time, that instinct did not fade. It evolved into something more refined, more internal. Now, even in silence, there is an awareness of rhythm operating beneath thought. Not always musical in form, but present in timing, in perception, in the way attention moves from one moment to the next. This hidden structure does not demand expression. It simply exists as a constant internal orientation. As the day continues, the contrast between external activity and internal stillness becomes more noticeable again. The world outside resumes its pace. Messages, schedules, movement, expectation, but internally, there is no requirement to match it immediately. Awareness can remain slightly behind or slightly apart, observing without urgency. This separation is not distance in a negative sense. It is simply a different mode of engagement. In creative spaces, ideas do not arrive as dramatic inspiration. They arrive as quiet suggestions, a phrase that feels almost complete, a melody fragment that appears briefly and then disappears, a visual impression that does not yet belong to anything specific. Nothing insists on becoming finished. Everything is allowed to remain in an unfinished state, which often feels more natural than completion. There is a kind of comfort in this unfinished quality. It mirrors the way life itself feels when not observed through external expectation. Not everything needs resolution. Not every thought needs direction. Not every moment needs to be understood immediately. Some experiences exist purely as presence, without needing transformation into outcome. Even public identity, which is often seen as fixed from the outside, feels internally fluid. The version of self that appears on stage, the version that exists in private rooms, the version that moves through travel and family life. None of these fully override the others. Instead, they coexist in layers, each one becoming more or less visible depending on context. There is no need for one to dominate. They simply rotate in presence. In quieter hours, when external demands pause briefly, awareness returns again to simplicity, sitting without intention, looking at light without analysing it, listening to distant sound without attaching meaning. These experiences do not create narrative, but they restore balance. They remind the mind that existence does not always require direction. There is also a subtle awareness of how time behaves differently depending on attention. When focused outward, time feels structured, segmented, measured. When attention turns inward, time becomes less defined. It stretches, softens, loses its sharpness. Moments begin to feel less like points in sequence and more like spaces that gently overlap. This shifting perception of time has become a quiet constant across years of movement and change. Despite travel across countries, stages, and phases of life, the internal experience of presence retains a recognizable continuity. It does not feel anchored to place or achievement. It feels anchored to perception itself. And within that perception, silence continues to play an important role, not as absence, but as background. Even when sound exists, silence remains underneath it, shaping how everything is experienced. It is not something that arrives or leaves. It is something that persists regardless of activity. As the day moves forward, this interplay between movement and stillness continues without conflict. One does not cancel the other. They coexist, gently balanced. External life progresses, while internal awareness remains steady. And in that balance, there is a quiet stability that does not require attention to sustain it. Nothing dramatic shifts, nothing resolves. The day simply continues in its layered form, light expanding, sound returning, thought unfolding, while something deeper remains unchanged beneath it all. A steady presence, quietly observing, always continuing. The afternoon arrives without announcement, slipping in through changing light rather than any clear moment of arrival. Shadows shorten, then shift again as clouds pass unseen beyond the window. Inside the house, the atmosphere feels slightly more awake, yet still restrained, as if the space is participating in the day without fully committing to its pace. Objects feel more defined now, edges sharper under stronger light, but the quiet underneath everything remains untouched. It is not the absence of activity that defines this moment, but the gentle coexistence of movement and stillness. Somewhere in the background of awareness there is always the subtle memory of sound, not loud or demanding, but layered into perception itself. The rhythm of past rehearsals, the flow of words turned into music, the sensation of timing that once guided entire performances. In earlier years, when Shakira was still shaping her identity through constant creation, sound was not something external to approach. It was something that seemed to emerge from within the way she observed the world. Even ordinary moments carried potential rhythm, as if life itself was quietly musical before it was ever expressed. That sensitivity does not disappear with time, it simply becomes more internal. In later years, it is no longer about finding rhythm in everything, but about noticing how rhythm already exists beneath everything, the cadence of movement between places, the timing of silence between conversations, the invisible structure that holds attention as it shifts from one thought to another. It becomes less about creation and more about recognition. In the afternoon quiet, this recognition often surfaces without effort. Sitting in a room that is neither fully private nor fully public, awareness drifts through subtle details. The way light moves across a table, the faint sound of something distant outside, the stillness of objects that do not require interaction to exist meaningfully. These small perceptions do not form a story, but they form a state of being. There are moments when the mind briefly returns to earlier stages of life, not as nostalgia, but as observation. The young artist in Barranquilla, not yet surrounded by global attention, but already deeply engaged with sound and expression. That phase of life was not simpler in feeling, but more immediate. There was less separation between experience and interpretation. Everything was being felt as it happened, without distance. As life expands, distance becomes part of perception. Not emotional distance, but structural distance. The awareness that experiences can be observed while also being lived. This dual awareness becomes a constant companion. On stage, while performing in front of thousands, there is still a quiet internal observer noticing everything as it unfolds. Not judging, not interrupting, simply witnessing. After the intensity of public presence, returning to quieter environments brings a different kind of awareness. The contrast does not feel like switching identities, but like shifting focus between layers of the same self. One layer engages, another observes. One responds outwardly, another remains inwardly steady. Neither disappears, both continue simultaneously. In travel, this layered awareness becomes even more pronounced. Airports, hotels, studios, unfamiliar cities all become temporary frames for experience. Each place holds activity, but also contains its own silence. And within that silence, there is a consistency that does not depend on geography. The internal sense of presence remains unchanged even as surroundings constantly shift. There is a particular kind of calm that appears in these transitional spaces. Not the calm of rest, but the calm of not needing to define what comes next immediately. Waiting without anticipation. Moving without urgency, observing without conclusion. It is a state that does not seek direction, yet does not feel lost. Even creativity, often associated with momentum and inspiration, behaves differently within this calm. It becomes less about reaching for ideas and more about allowing them to appear when they choose. A melody fragment may surface briefly during a quiet moment and then dissolve without commitment. A phrase might form in thought, not yet belonging to any project. Nothing is forced into structure before it is ready. The afternoon light continues to shift, gradually warming the space in a way that feels slow and continuous. There is no sharp boundary between one phase of the day and another. Instead, everything blends. Thought blends into silence. Movement blends into stillness. Awareness blends into background presence. In this blending, identity feels less like a defined shape and more like a flowing continuity. Not something that changes abruptly, but something that adapts without losing its core. Performer, mother, creator, traveller, observer, each aspect appears when needed, then recedes without disappearing completely. As time moves forward, the sense of urgency that often defines external schedules feels increasingly distant from internal experience. There is activity, yes, but it is no longer the only measure of time. Stillness becomes equally significant. Reflection becomes equally valid. Even doing nothing becomes a form of presence rather than absence. And in the quiet continuation of the afternoon, there is a subtle realization that nothing here requires completion. Not thoughts, not feelings, not moments. Everything is allowed to remain partially open, gently unfolding at its own pace. The day does not demand resolution, it simply continues. The light begins to soften again, not yet evening, but no longer fully afternoon. It changes slowly across the room, stretching shadows a little longer, deepening the edges of everything it touches. The house feels quieter in a different way now, less like stillness held tightly, and more like stillness settling downward. Even the air seems to slow its movement, as if responding to the subtle shift in time. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything feels slightly more inward than before. There is a familiar sensation that often arrives in this part of the day, a quiet in-between where thoughts stop moving forward with direction and instead begin to drift sideways. Not memories exactly, not plans, just impressions. A sound remembered without context. A feeling attached to no specific moment. In this state, awareness does not search. It simply receives whatever appears and lets it pass without holding it. In this softened space of perception, the presence of earlier life gently returns again. Not as narrative, but as atmosphere. The sense of a younger Shakira sitting in rooms where music was still forming its identity, not yet separated into expectation or scale. At that time, rhythm was not something performed. It was something discovered continuously, even in silence. The way words naturally carried cadence. The way emotion moved through sound before it became structured into songs. That early relationship with sound never truly left. It simply changed form. In later years, it exists less in external expression and more in internal recognition. Rhythm is still present, but it is no longer always audible. It appears in timing, in breath, in the pauses between thoughts. Even in stillness, there is a quiet sense of structure that feels almost musical, though no sound is being made. As the day leans further toward evening, the house begins to feel more enclosed by its own calm. Not smaller, but more contained. Light no longer spreads widely. It gathers. Corners grow softer, shadows deepen gently, and surfaces lose some of their earlier brightness. The world outside continues its motion, but it feels increasingly distant, as if separated by layers of quiet. In these hours, awareness often turns inward without intention. There is no deliberate reflection, yet reflection happens anyway, not in conclusions, but in observation. The sense that life has been experienced in overlapping layers, some public, some private, some remembered, some still unfolding. None of these layers feels more real than the others. They simply exist together, shaping perception from different angles. There is also a subtle awareness of how much of life is lived between defined moments. Not on stage, not in interviews, not in visible milestones, but in transitions. Moving from one place to another, waiting before something begins, sitting after something has ended. These in-between states often carry the most quiet continuity, even though they rarely appear in stories told outwardly. In one of these quiet intervals there is a simple act of sitting without purpose, not resting from exhaustion, not waiting for anything specific, just existing in a moment that does not require direction. The mind does not need to organize itself here. It does not need to produce or resolve. It can simply remain open, lightly aware of everything and nothing at once. This openness allows perception to soften further. Sounds from outside become less distinct, more atmospheric. Internal thought loses urgency and becomes more fluid. Even identity feels less like something defined and more like something experienced moment by moment. Not fixed, not fragmented, just continuously present in different forms depending on attention. There is a kind of quiet understanding that begins to emerge in this state, though it is never fully formed into words. It is not an idea, but a recognition that nothing essential is missing in stillness, that silence is not absence, but another way of being with everything at once. That movement and rest are not opposites, but variations of the same continuity. In the background of this awareness, music still exists, not as sound, but as memory of structure. The instinct for timing, the sensitivity to rhythm, the way emotion can align itself with movement in ways that do not require explanation. Even when no music is playing, that internal orientation remains, quietly shaping perception without drawing attention to itself. As evening approaches more clearly, the light becomes even softer, leaning toward warmth that feels less directional and more ambient. The house does not change, but its atmosphere does. Everything becomes slightly slower, slightly more reflective, slightly more distant from urgency. And in that gradual settling, there is no need for anything to conclude. No moment demands closure. No thought requires resolution. Everything simply continues in its softened form, held gently within a quiet that does not ask to be noticed, but is always there. Evening arrives in a way that feels almost weightless, as if the day has quietly folded into itself without leaving any clear edge between what was and what is now. The light outside the windows turns softer, more diffused, and the interior of the house begins to carry a deeper shade of calm. Shadows settle into corners with a familiar patience, and even the most ordinary objects seem to rest more fully in place. Nothing changes abruptly. Everything simply becomes quieter in layers. It is the kind of transition that does not ask for attention, yet gently takes it anyway. Inside this gradual dimming, awareness feels less divided than before. The mind no longer moves with the structure of the day, but with something slower and more continuous. Thoughts do not arrive as conclusions or directions. They drift in and out like reflections on still water. There is no urgency to organize them. They exist briefly, then dissolve without resistance. In this state, even silence feels less like absence and more like a soft background presence that holds everything together. Somewhere within this quiet, memory does not return as a sequence, but as atmosphere once again. A younger Shakira appears not as a figure of achievement, but as a presence within early creative space, listening, observing, absorbing rhythm from everything around her. In those earlier years, sound is not something separated from life. It is woven into it. The cadence of speech, the repetition of daily movement, the natural rhythm of emotion, all of it exists without needing explanation. It is simply noticed, deeply and instinctively. That way of noticing never disappears. It simply becomes quieter as life expands outward. In later years, rhythm no longer needs to be searched, for it is already understood internally. It appears in pauses between decisions, in the timing of breath after movement, in the subtle structure of attention itself. Even when no external sound exists, there is still a sense of underlying flow, an internal continuity that does not rely on environment. As evening deepens further, the house begins to feel more enclosed in its calm, not smaller, but more inwardly focused. Light now gathers in fewer places, and surfaces lose their earlier brightness. The feeling of the day outside becomes distant, almost abstract. Inside, everything feels slightly slower, as if the space itself is no longer responding to time in the same way. It is not sleep yet, but a preparation for it that does not require effort. In this space, reflection becomes softer and less structured. There is no attempt to understand life in full, only to observe how it has been experienced in fragments. Moments of performance, moments of travel, moments of private stillness, all existing side by side without needing to be ordered into hierarchy. Each one carries its own texture, its own version of awareness. None cancels the other. They simply coexist. There is also a quiet recognition that much of life unfolds in transitions rather than fixed points. Moving between cities, moving between roles, moving between visibility and privacy. These transitions are not interruptions. They are part of the rhythm itself. In fact, they often contain a deeper sense of presence than the moments that are more clearly defined. Because in transition, awareness is not fully attached to any single direction. Even in stillness, there is subtle internal movement. Not physical, not emotional in a dramatic sense, but perceptual. Attention shifts gently from one impression to another without needing to commit. A faint sound outside, the feeling of fabric against skin, the presence of light fading into warmer tones. These small details do not form meaning individually, but together they create a quiet field of awareness that feels continuous and unforced. In this field, identity feels less like something held and more like something experienced in motion. There is no single version of self that dominates. Instead, there are overlapping states: creative, reflective, present, distant, engaged, withdrawn, all appearing and softening in response to context. This fluidity does not create confusion, it creates space, and within that space, creativity continues to exist quietly, even when not expressed. Not as production, but as potential. A melody that might form, a lyric that might surface, a rhythm that might appear in thought and then fade again. Nothing needs to be captured immediately. It is enough that it passes through awareness at all. Outside, the world continues its evening rhythm, lights turning on in distant places, movement slowing in some areas and increasing in others. But inside, time feels less segmented. It no longer moves in clear units. It becomes more like a gradual deepening, where each moment blends into the next without sharp separation. There is a kind of peace in this lack of division. Not emotional intensity, not excitement, but a steady quietness that does not need to be maintained. It simply exists, like something that has always been present beneath everything else. Even when attention moves away from it, it remains. As the evening settles further toward night, the awareness of this continuity becomes even softer. Nothing is being completed. Nothing is being resolved. Everything is simply continuing in its own way. Thought, memory, perception, silence. And in that continuation there is no final moment needed. Only presence, gently unfolding without end. Night arrives without ceremony as it always does, but tonight it feels deeper, less like an arrival and more like a settling. The last traces of evening light withdraw from the windows slowly, leaving behind a stillness that feels complete in its own quiet way. The house no longer feels like a space defined by rooms or corridors. It feels like one continuous atmosphere of calm, stretching through everything without interruption. Even the faintest sounds from outside seem to lose their edges before they can enter fully. Inside this deeper night, awareness becomes softer, almost weightless. Thoughts do not form in sequences anymore. They appear briefly and dissolve before they can take shape. There is no effort to follow them. They come and go like distant impressions that never fully arrive. In this state, silence is no longer something noticed. It is something lived within. It holds everything gently without needing to define anything. Somewhere in this quiet, memory returns again, but without urgency. A young Shakira moving through early creative spaces where music is still being discovered rather than performed. There is no separation yet between observation and expression. Rhythm is not something created intentionally. It is something encountered in everyday life. The way emotion naturally shapes voice. The way movement carries its own timing. The way silence itself can feel structured without needing sound. That early sensitivity remains, even as life expands into something far larger and more visible. It simply becomes internalized. In later years, rhythm no longer needs to be external to be felt. It exists in the spacing between thoughts, in the pacing of attention, in the subtle timing of breath during stillness. Even when nothing is happening outwardly, something continues inwardly in quiet alignment. The house, now fully in night, feels less like a physical structure and more like a shared state of calm. Light is minimal, and what remains is soft and indirect. Shadows do not feel heavy. They feel natural, as if they belong more fully now than brightness did earlier. Everything is reduced to essentials: presence, silence, and perception. In this reduced space, reflection becomes even less structured. There is no attempt to revisit life as a narrative. Instead, there is only observation of how life continues to exist in layers. Public moments and private moments, loud moments and silent ones, moments of movement and moments of stillness. None of them compete for importance. They simply exist as different expressions of the same continuity. There is a subtle awareness that identity, when seen from within, does not remain fixed. It moves depending on context, yet something underneath remains unchanged. Not a role, not a label, but a simple capacity to be aware. That awareness is present whether in performance, in travel, in creation, or in solitude. It does not increase or decrease. It only shifts where attention is placed. Even in complete stillness, there is a faint sense of internal rhythm. Not music, not sound, but timing. The timing of thought before it disappears. The timing of breath as it settles into rest. The timing of awareness as it moves from one impression to another without force. This rhythm is not performed. It is inherent. Outside, the world continues in its own night patterns. Some places still active, others already asleep. But none of that enters fully here. Inside, everything is slowed to its simplest form. There is no expectation of response, no requirement for direction, just continuity. In this continuity, even silence feels layered. Not empty, but full in a way that does not demand interpretation. It does not ask to be understood. It simply remains present, holding everything equally without preference or tension. At some point, the distinction between observer and environment becomes less noticeable. There is just awareness, soft, steady, uninterrupted. Not focused, not scattered, just present in a way that does not require effort. Thoughts may still arise, but they no longer define the state of being. They pass through it like gentle movement through still air. And within this deep night, there is no sense of ending approaching. No final realization, no closing thought. Only the quiet continuation of presence itself, unchanging, unforced, and gently infinite in its stillness. The night no longer feels like a part of time. It feels like time has dissolved into something softer, something without edges or direction. The house is completely still now, not in the sense of emptiness, but in the sense of being fully settled into itself. Every room feels equally quiet, every surface resting in the same shared calm. Even the idea of later begins to lose meaning, as if nothing is moving toward anything anymore. There is only this continuous present, stretching gently without resistance. In this depth of silence, awareness becomes even more delicate. It does not focus or search. It simply exists, lightly touching whatever arises, and letting it go just as gently. Thoughts appear without urgency, like faint impressions on water that disappear before forming shape. There is no need to follow them, no need to return to them. They are part of the atmosphere, not interruptions within it. Somewhere in this softened awareness, memory is no longer structured. It does not arrive as scenes or stories, but as emotional texture. A feeling of early mornings filled with quiet expectation. A sense of standing before sound becomes form. The presence of a younger Shakira exists here not as biography, but as a sensation of beginnings, when everything is still unshaped and attention itself is the main guide. In that stage of life, creation is not separate from living. It is embedded within it. That same embedded rhythm continues quietly through all later versions of life, even when the external world becomes vast and defined. It is no longer visible in the same way, but it is still present in structure. The spacing between moments, the way attention moves from one thing to another without force, the internal timing that exists even when nothing is being performed or produced. It is not something remembered, it is something continuously lived. The house, fully absorbed in night, feels like it has stopped distinguishing between inside and outside. The idea of boundaries becomes less important. Light, sound, and silence all feel part of the same field. Even darkness is not heavy. It is simply the absence of need for visibility. Everything exists without needing to be fully seen. In this state, reflection no longer tries to organize experience. There is no effort to understand life as a sequence of events. Instead, there is only recognition that everything has been experienced in layers that overlap and coexist. Some layers are loud, others quiet, some are shared, others private, some are remembered, others still unfolding. None of them need to resolve into a single interpretation. There is also a subtle awareness that much of what is considered life happens between clearly defined moments. Not in the performance itself, but before and after it. Not in arrival, but in transition. These in-between spaces often carry the most honest sense of presence, because they are not shaped by expectation. They simply exist. Even now, in this deepest part of night, there is no effort to reach meaning. Meaning feels unnecessary here. What remains is only awareness, steady, quiet, unpressured. It does not move forward or backward. It does not try to become anything else. It simply continues. Breath becomes part of this continuity without being observed. Thought becomes part of it without being followed. Silence becomes part of it without being noticed as separate. Everything merges into a single soft presence that does not require definition. And in that presence there is no boundary between rest and wakefulness, no boundary between memory and now, no boundary between self and space. Only a quiet, uninterrupted being that does not begin and does not end. It simply remains. A stillness so complete that even time feels like it has stopped trying to move. The deepest part of the night feels almost like a pause that has forgotten it is supposed to end. The house no longer carries the sense of being lived in moment by moment. It feels suspended, as if existence itself has softened into a single, uninterrupted breath. No room feels separate from another. No corner feels distant. Everything is held in the same quiet field of stillness, where even thought seems to hesitate before forming. In this near silent space, awareness becomes so subtle it is almost indistinguishable from the environment itself. There is no direction to it, no center, no edge. It does not move toward anything, nor away from anything. It simply remains, lightly present, like a soft current that does not disturb what it passes through. Even the idea of observing begins to fade, because there is nothing separate left to observe. Somewhere within this dissolving boundary between thought and silence, fragments of a long life appear without structure. Not scenes, not memories in sequence, just impressions that surface and vanish. A rehearsal room filled with distant echoes of rhythm, a stage light warming the air before sound begins, a quiet space where a younger Shakira once listened more than she spoke, absorbing the invisible timing of everything around her. These fragments do not form a story. They simply exist as traces of experience that no longer need context. Even now, in this stillness far removed from beginnings, that same sensitivity to rhythm remains quietly embedded. It is no longer something practiced or noticed. It is something that continues on its own, beneath awareness. The timing between thoughts, the natural spacing of attention, the subtle pacing of existence itself. It is not music anymore, and yet it carries the structure of music without needing sound. The house, now fully immersed in night, no longer feels like it contains time. Instead, time feels like it is resting within it. There is no progression, only presence, no movement from one moment to another, only a continuous unfolding that does not require change. Even silence no longer feels like an absence. It feels like the default state of everything when nothing is being asked of it. In this state, reflection becomes unnecessary. There is no attempt to understand life, no attempt to organize meaning. Everything that needed to be experienced has already been experienced in its own way. What remains is not interpretation, but continuation. A quiet awareness that does not reach forward or backward. Even identity, when it appears in this depth of stillness, does not hold shape for long. It dissolves gently into awareness itself. There is no strong separation between someone and everything else, only a subtle presence that is aware without needing to define itself as separate from what it perceives. Outside, the world still exists in its distant motion, cities continuing their invisible rhythm, nights unfolding in other places, but none of it enters here in any structured way. It exists, but it does not interrupt. It does not demand attention. It is simply part of the same vast quiet that contains everything without distinction. Inside this quiet, even time begins to feel unnecessary. There is no anticipation of morning, no memory of earlier hours, no sense of what comes next. Only the softness of what is already here, gently continuing without effort or direction. And in that continuation, something becomes clear without being thought. Nothing is missing in this stillness. Nothing is incomplete. Nothing is waiting to be resolved. There is only presence, steady, unshaped, and quietly complete, in its own unending way. Not an ending, not a beginning. The night settles even further, reaching a point where it no longer feels like time is passing at all, but rather that everything has dissolved into a single, uninterrupted stillness. The house is no longer experienced as separate spaces or levels. It is simply presence, spread evenly and quietly through itself. Even the faintest distinction between inside and outside has softened to the point where it no longer feels important. There is only a continuous, gentle quiet that holds everything without effort. In this depth of silence, awareness becomes almost indistinguishable from rest. There is no need to focus, no need to follow thought, no need to interpret sensation. Whatever arises does so briefly, like a soft ripple that disappears before it can be named. Even the idea of thinking feels distant now, as if it belongs to another layer of experience that is no longer active. What remains is something simpler, pure presence without structure. Somewhere within this presence, fragments of a long, creative life still drift quietly, not as memories that are being recalled, but as impressions that naturally exist within awareness. A rehearsal space filled with movement and timing. A distant stage where light and sound once met in carefully shaped rhythm. And the earlier image of a young Shakira, listening deeply to the world before shaping it into music, absorbing patterns, silence, and emotion without needing to define them. These fragments are not past events. They are echoes of perception that still exist within the field of awareness. Even now, long after those early beginnings, that same sensitivity to rhythm continues in a quieter form. It no longer appears as music being created in real time, but as an internal structure beneath everything else. The spacing of attention, the natural pause between thoughts, the subtle flow of perception as it moves from one impression to another. It is no longer noticed as something special. It is simply how awareness functions. The house remains still, but this stillness is no longer experienced as environment. It feels more like a shared condition between space and awareness itself. There is no separation strong enough to define where one ends and the other begins. Light, shadow, silence, and presence all exist within the same quiet continuity. Nothing interrupts it because nothing stands apart from it. In this state, even reflection disappears as an activity. There is no effort to understand life or organize it into meaning. There is only the gentle recognition that everything has already been unfolding in its own way, without needing to be shaped into conclusion. Experiences do not require explanation here. They simply exist as they are, complete in their momentary presence. Identity, too, becomes less defined. Not lost, not erased, just softened. The sense of someone experiencing begins to fade into the experience itself. Awareness no longer feels owned. It simply is. And in that simplicity, there is no tension between roles, memories, or versions of self. They all exist lightly, without conflict, without hierarchy. Outside, the world continues its distant rhythm, but it no longer feels separate enough to be considered outside. It is simply another expression of the same quiet continuity. Nothing intrudes upon this space because there is no boundary strong enough to be crossed. Even time, in this depth of night, loses its structure completely. There is no sense of before or after, no anticipation of change, no memory of progression, only an ongoing stillness that does not move forward because it is already complete in its presence. And within that completeness, nothing asks to be different. Nothing reaches for continuation, because continuation is already happening without effort. There is no beginning that needs to be found, and no ending that needs to arrive. Only this, steady, unbroken, quietly existing beyond the need for anything else. And even that thought dissolves into silence. The silence now feels so complete that even the idea of describing it begins to fade before it fully forms. It is no longer something surrounding experience, it is what experience has become. The house, the night, the awareness within it, all feel like expressions of the same quiet presence, no longer separable into parts. There is no sense of direction left, no sense of unfolding, only a stillness that does not move because it does not need to. In this depth, even perception becomes extremely light. There is no effort to notice anything, and yet everything is somehow present. Not as details, but as a unified softness. The feeling of space itself loses definition. It is neither empty nor full, it simply is, without reference. And within that, awareness remains, not as an active process, but as a quiet continuity that does not interrupt anything. Fragments of a long human life still exist here, but they no longer appear as memories in sequence. They are more like impressions held within the same field of stillness, a distant rehearsal room, a stage that once carried sound, a moment of listening before understanding, and within it all the early presence of a young Shakira, not as a figure of fame, but as a quiet point of attention shaped by rhythm, long before it became expression. Even those fragments are not revisited. They simply exist, without emphasis, without direction. The mind is no longer moving through them. They are just part of the same continuity that holds everything else. Nothing stands apart anymore as significant or separate. Everything has softened into equal presence. The sense of identity, too, has dissolved further, not into absence, but into neutrality. There is no centre from which experience is being observed. There is only experience itself, gently unfolding without structure. The idea of self no longer asserts itself as something distinct. It is neither present nor absent. It is unnecessary. Time, too, has fully released its shape. There is no movement forward, no return backward. Even the idea of now begins to lose meaning, because there is nothing to compare it against. What remains cannot be measured, because it does not progress. It simply continues without reference. The house no longer feels like a location. It does not feel like inside or outside. It feels like a field of stillness that has no boundary. Light and darkness no longer oppose each other. They are simply variations within the same quiet presence. Nothing changes it, because nothing stands apart from it. Even thought, when it arises faintly, does not form structure. It dissolves before becoming language. There is no effort to hold it, no need to complete it. It passes through awareness without leaving trace, like movement through still air that does not disturb anything. And in this absence of disturbance there is no search left for meaning, no search for understanding, no search for continuation. Everything that could be sought already exists within what is present. Nothing is missing, because nothing is being defined as separate. There is only this, an unbroken stillness that does not begin, does not end, and does not change, not emptiness, not fullness, not silence as contrast to sound, just what remains when nothing is divided anymore. And even this recognition fades gently, not into nothing, but into something so quiet it no longer needs to be known. The stillness no longer feels like a state that can be entered or left. It has become indistinguishable from existence itself, as if everything that could be experienced has gently dissolved into one continuous presence. There is no longer a sense of deeper or more quiet, because comparison itself has faded. What remains does not move, not because it is frozen, but because movement has lost meaning within it. Awareness continues, but without center, without direction, without distinction. It does not observe anything, because there is nothing separate to observe. It does not reflect, because reflection requires distance, and distance no longer exists in any form that can be recognized. It simply is, lightly, completely, without effort or identity. Even the memory of a life once filled with sound and motion exists only as a soft impression within this same continuity, a distant sense of stages that once held rhythm, moments of creation that once shaped emotion into form. And within that vast, quiet unfolding, the early presence of a young Shakira remains, not as biography, not as image, but as a subtle trace of attention learning how to listen to the world before ever transforming it. But even that trace does not stand apart anymore. It does not form a past. It does not point to a beginning. It exists only as part of the same undivided field, where everything that ever was and everything that is now are no longer experienced as separate states. The idea of time has completely dissolved. There is no sequence left to follow, no unfolding to track. There is only continuity without progression, not stillness that follows movement, and not movement that leads to stillness, but something that contains neither distinction. A presence that does not evolve because it does not require change. The house, the night, the world beyond it, all of these concepts lose their framing entirely. There is no longer an inside or outside, no longer a space that contains experience. There is only experience without container, awareness without boundary, and even those words feel unnecessary as they form, dissolving as soon as they appear. Identity no longer arises in any stable form. There is no someone experiencing this, no point of reference that remains constant. Instead, there is only the quiet fact of being, unclaimed, unshaped, unlocalized. It does not belong anywhere because it is not separate enough to belong. Thought, when it attempts to arise, does not find structure. It does not develop into language or meaning. It fades before it can differentiate itself from silence. And in that fading, nothing is lost, because nothing is being held. There is no direction forward, no return backward, no awareness of duration. Even the sense of continuing is no longer applicable, because continuation implies movement through time. Here, there is only what is, not as a moment, not as a state, but as something beyond the need to define either. Everything that could be noticed is already part of this same quiet totality. Nothing is excluded from it. Nothing stands apart from it. There is no observer separate from what is observed, no experience separate from being experienced. And so even the idea of describing it begins to dissolve entirely, because there is nothing outside it from which it could be described. Only this, without beginning, without ending, without separation. And even that thought disappears into the same stillness it was trying to point toward. There is no longer any sense that something is unfolding, not because it has stopped, but because there is nothing outside it to measure unfolding against. Everything that once appeared as change now feels like a single, continuous presence that does not require recognition. Even the idea of continuing no longer creates direction. It simply dissolves as soon as it forms, like a ripple that never finds a surface to travel across. Awareness remains, but it is no longer positioned anywhere. It does not rise above experience, and it does not sit within it. It is not separate enough to be described as watching, and not absent enough to be called nothing. It is simply what is, without framing, without identity, without contrast. The memory of a life shaped by sound, movement, and expression still exists, but not as something recalled. It is more like a quiet echo embedded within the same undivided field, a distant sense of stages, cities, voices, and rhythm. And within that echo, the early presence of a young Shakira remains, not as a person being remembered, but as part of the same continuity where all experiences already belong. Yet even this distinction fades. There is no earlier or later holding it in place, no separation between what was lived and what is present. Everything exists without timeline, without order, without progression, not layered, not stacked, simply unified in stillness. The idea of space also loses its structure. There is no longer a sense of being inside a place or outside of it. No house, no room, no surrounding world. Only a quiet totality that does not define itself through boundaries. Even silence no longer stands apart from sound, because neither is distinguishable here. All contrasts have gently dissolved. Identity, too, no longer forms even as a faint impression. There is no reference point from which experience is happening, no center holding perspective, no observer behind awareness. What remains does not belong to anyone, because there is no separation in which ownership could exist. Thought, when it appears, does not develop. It does not become language or meaning. It does not move toward completion. It simply fades at the moment of arising, as if it never needed to take form at all. And nothing is lost in that fading, because nothing is being held. There is no longer a sense of night or morning, beginning or end, rest or wakefulness. These distinctions no longer reach this far. What remains is not a state that time can enter. It is not within time at all. It is what remains when time is no longer being divided. And in this unbroken presence there is nothing to resolve, nothing to reach, nothing to return from, nothing to continue. Only what has always been here, before any movement was ever imagined. And even the awareness of that dissolves, not into absence, but into something so complete it no longer needs to be known. There is nothing left that can be called continuation, because even the idea of continuation depends on something moving forward from something else. And here, there is no from and no toward, only a still presence that does not shift because there is no distance left for it to cross. Awareness is not positioned within anything. It is not rising above experience, nor contained inside it. It does not take shape as a point of view, nor dissolve into emptiness. It simply remains as what is, without needing to define itself as remaining. The memory of everything that once felt like a life, sound, movement, travel, creation, silence, no longer forms sequence or narrative. It exists only as a faint, undivided impression within the same field where all distinctions have already softened. Even the presence of a young Shakira is not recalled as a person or moment, but exists as part of the same quiet completeness, where nothing is separated into past or present. There is no longer a sense of her as distinct from anything else, no longer a sense of life as something unfolding. These are only words that once pointed toward experience, but here they no longer point anywhere. They dissolve as soon as they form, because there is nothing external for them to describe. Time has not stopped. It has become irrelevant, not absent, not frozen, simply without function. There is no progression to hold it, no sequence to structure it. What remains cannot be placed along any line, because no line exists. Space, too, is no longer a framework. There is no inside, no outside, no distance between awareness and what might be experienced. Everything that could suggest separation has already faded. What remains is not unified through effort. It was never divided to begin with. Even silence is no longer a contrast to sound. It is not an absence, not a background, not a field. It is simply indistinguishable from everything else. And in that indistinction there is no need to name it. Identity does not arise even as a trace. There is no center from which anything is happening. No observer, no experiencer, no subject. Only the quiet fact of being, without ownership or position. Thought does not form, and when something like thought almost appears, it dissolves before becoming recognizable. Not because it is interrupted, but because there is no structure in which it can continue. There is no direction left to move in, no depth left to reach, no state left to enter. Even stillness is no longer an accurate description, because stillness implies contrast with motion. Here, there is no contrast. Only what cannot be divided. Only what cannot be observed from outside. Only what does not change because it is not positioned within anything that could change. And even this description loses meaning as it forms, because there is nothing separate enough for language to point toward. What remains is not an ending, not a continuation, not a state, not even silence, just what has always been, without ever needing to be recognized as anything at all. There is no further place for the narrative to move toward, because movement itself depends on separation between what is here and what is next. And here, there is no separation left that can hold next. What remains is not progression, not expansion, not even stillness as a defined state. It is something without reference point, where nothing stands apart enough to be followed or observed. Awareness is present, but it is no longer distinguishable as awareness. There is no position from which it is happening, no distance from what might be experienced, no boundary that would allow something to be called experience at all. The idea of a life, its stages, its sounds, its silences, no longer arranges itself into memory or meaning. It does not appear as a sequence. It does not appear as a whole. It does not appear as anything that can be held apart. Even the faintest trace of a young Shakira, once associated with beginnings, rhythm, and the early shaping of expression, is no longer situated in time or identity. It is not recalled. It is not observed. It simply exists, or rather, it does not exist separately from anything else that is not separate. And that distinction collapses before it forms. There is no her, no then, no before, no after. Only a completeness that cannot be divided into elements without immediately ceasing to be what it is. Silence cannot be identified, because there is nothing outside it to define it against. Time cannot be located, because there is no movement for it to measure. Space cannot be perceived, because there is no distance in which perception could take shape. Even the idea of continuing becomes impossible, because continuation implies something extending beyond something else. And there is nothing beyond. Not because something has ended, but because nothing was ever separated enough to begin. What remains is not an experience, not an awareness of experience, not a witness to anything unfolding. It is simply what does not require distinction to be what it is. And as soon as language touches it, even lightly, it dissolves. Not into nothing, but into the same unbroken presence that was never separate enough to be described in the first place. There is no further beyond this point, because beyond is already a form of separation, an imagined space where something could move away from something else. And here, nothing is apart, not even as an idea. What remains is not continuation, not depth, not stillness, not silence. Each of those depends on contrast, and contrast no longer forms. There is no foreground and background, no observer and observed, no inside or outside that could give structure to experience. Awareness is not absent, but it is no longer something that can be located. It does not sit within anything. It does not extend through anything. It is not centered anywhere. It is not even one. Because one still implies comparison with many, and comparison has no ground here. The memory of a life shaped by sound, movement, travel, and creation does not return, because there is no direction from which anything could return. Even the impression of a young Shakira, once associated with rhythm, expression, beginnings, no longer exists as reference or echo. It does not fade. It does not persist. It is not present or absent. It is simply not distinguishable from anything else that is not distinguishable. And even that description collapses as it appears, because language itself depends on separation between what is named and what is not. Here, nothing is unnamed because nothing is singled out to be named in the first place. Time is not stopped. It is not absent. It is not still. It has no structure at all that could be acknowledged or removed. There is no moment to hold it, no sequence to place it in, no direction for it to follow. Space is not empty. It is not full. It is not even space. It is not available as a concept because there is no distance for it to define. Even silence is no longer recognizable as silence, because recognition requires contrast, and contrast has dissolved. Identity does not arise, not even as a faint impression. There is no someone to whom anything is happening, and no something that is happening to be experienced. And without that separation, experience itself cannot be isolated as a category. There is only what cannot be divided without ceasing to be described at all. And as soon as it is pointed to, even gently, even quietly, even in the most careful language, it is already no longer something that can be held as a description. Not because it has gone somewhere, but because it was never separate enough to be captured in the first place. And so even this final attempt to continue dissolves where it appears. There is nothing further that can be added here that would extend it, because extension requires a direction, and direction requires separation, and separation has already dissolved completely. What remains is not a continuation of anything previously described, and not a transition into anything new. It is not progression, not deepening, not expansion, not stillness as an object, and not silence as a condition. Each of those still belongs to a framework where something could be distinguished from something else. Here, there is no such framework left to stand on. Awareness is not located anywhere. It does not arise, it does not persist, it does not fade. These descriptions that depend on time, and time no longer has structure here. There is no sequence for anything to follow, no interval for anything to occur within. Even the sense of a life, its music, its movement, its quiet intervals, does not appear as memory or absence. It is not retraced, not revisited, not observed. The presence of a young Shakira, once associated with beginnings and rhythm, is not distinguishable from anything else that is not distinguishable. It does not stand as a point in time or identity. It does not stand at all. And even that statement dissolves, because standing implies position, and position implies separation. There is no position. There is no frame in which anything can be held apart long enough to be identified. Time is not still. It is not moving. It is not absent. It is not applicable. There is no structure for it to inhabit. Space is not surrounding anything. It is not within anything. It is not here or there. It is not a field or a void. It cannot be referenced because reference itself depends on distance. Silence is not present as contrast to sound. Sound is not absent as contrast to silence. Neither exists as distinct condition, because distinction itself has dissolved into undivided presence. Identity does not form even as a trace. There is no observer, no experiencer, no point from which anything is happening. Without that separation, there is no experience to be held as something occurring. And so what remains cannot be described as a state, because states imply change from one condition to another. There is no change here, not because something has stopped, but because nothing is separate enough to change. And even as this is being expressed, the expression cannot hold itself apart from what it is pointing toward, because there is nothing external for it to point to. It does not end, it does not continue, it does not begin, it does not remain, it simply is. And even that dissolves as soon as it is spoken.